Hi, students. Time flies whenever you're having fun. We're working our way up into the 1990s. Today's lesson will focus on George H.W. Bush and Desert Storm.
As the 80s drew to a close, President Ronald Reagan was immensely popular, so it was natural that his vice president, George H.W. Bush, would try to succeed him in 1988.
I wish people could see him as I see him, and as thousands of people see him. And I always loved the time someone said to George, "How can you run for president? You don't have any constituency." And George said, "Well, I've got a great big family and thousands of friends." And that's what he has.
For more than 40 years, George Bush has met every challenge his country and the world have offered up to him. The truth is, the more you learn about George Bush, the more you realize that perhaps no one in this century is better prepared to be President of the United States.
George H.W. Bush's history as a fighter pilot, politician, and CIA director contributed to his victory in 1988. Also, his campaign ads were successful in portraying his opponent, Michael Dukakis, as passionless and lacking commitment in the war on crime.
Count on to be tough on crime. George Bush, experienced leadership for America's future.
One of George H.W. Bush's most important campaign pledges was a refusal to raise anyone's taxes.
My opponent won't rule out raising taxes, but I will, and the Congress will push me to raise taxes, and I'll say no, and they'll push, and I'll say no, and they'll push again, and I'll say to them, read my lips. No new taxes.
At the time, both houses of Congress had a Democratic majority, so President Bush, a Republican, really would be the last line of defense against tax hikes. But to resolve the issue of the country's rising deficit during a hard economic recession, President Bush gave in to pressure from Democrats and voted to raise some taxes in 1990. Bush didn't consult any other Republicans before making the decision. To be fair, he didn't need to, and there was an immediate backlash from voters and colleagues. George H.W. Bush was known for more than his broken tax promise. In 1989, the first year of Bush's presidency, a series of Supreme Court decisions made it extremely difficult for workers to sue over racial discrimination in the workplace. However, Bush vetoed the bill. The president said he feared the bill would result in racial quotas or mandatory numbers of minority workers for most businesses in the country. Congress passed the 1991 Civil Rights Act the following year, and Bush did not veto this bill. It was a watered-down, less effective version of the vetoed bill, but it included two major features that were helpful to plaintiffs in employment discrimination cases. It allowed cases to be decided by juries and allowed workers who could prove that they had been discriminated against to at least recover their courtroom and attorney fees. Bush's most lasting achievement was the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. It made discrimination against disabled people illegal and also made accessibility a key consideration in all public construction projects like wheelchair ramps, and elevators. Right-wing politicians were concerned about the government telling businesses what to do. But the president persuaded his Republican colleagues to support the bill by claiming it would reduce the number of disabled Americans who rely on government support for living expenses. President Bush also signed the Clean Air Act amendments in 1990, which reduced the amount of toxic pollutants that businesses could release into the environment. Bush's presidency was defined by war as well as influential legislation. In 1990, the United States led a coalition army into the Middle Eastern countries of Kuwait and Iraq, a conflict known today as the Gulf War. The Gulf War began when the leader of Iraq, a dictator named Saddam Hussein, decided to send troops south of its borders into Kuwait, a small country on the Persian Gulf. Hussein had said that Kuwait had been selling more oil than it was supposed to sell, thus lowering the overall price of oil around the world and costing poor and war-torn Iraq even more money. To make matters worse, Saddam Hussein had become increasingly paranoid and confrontational over his decade of dictatorial rule, especially after the Iran-Iraq wars from 1980 to 1988, where the United States secretly sold weapons to both sides of that conflict. Most Arab leaders disliked Hussein, who did little to prevent violence against non-Iraqis within his own country. When Hussein lashed out against Kuwait with a military invasion in 1990, the world was against him. Iraq's army entered Kuwait on August 2, 1990, and conquered its capital within 12 hours. A week later, Saddam Hussein declared that one of his cousins would be Kuwait's next ruler. He also demanded the withdrawal of Jews from Israel and paraded Westerners on TV as hostages. George H.W. Bush told Hussein that all Iraqi forces had to leave Kuwait, and the leaders of the United Nations agreed. On November 29th, the UN passed a resolution stating that a global military action would force Iraqi troops out of Kuwait if they hadn't pulled back by January 15, 1991. The deadline came and Saddam Hussein refused to call off the invasion. Instead, he began threatening Saudi Arabia, which supplied most of the world's oil at the time. What followed was Operation Desert Storm, a military operation led by the United States but supported by countries around the world. Soldiers from Europe, Africa, Australia, Arabia, and the Americas all participated. The U.S.-led coalition launched a ground war into Kuwait and Iraq that lasted only 100 hours. Kuwait was freed and Iraqi troops fled back to their country where coalition forces almost advanced to their capital. The war was an overwhelming victory for the United States and its president, George H.W. Bush, whose approval ratings reached 89% after the fighting was over. This was the first military campaign to receive around-the-clock media coverage, but the American military strictly controlled which images and stories could be related to the American public. The result was a completely positive image of American dominance and influence. Kuwait and Iraq were devastated by war. Retreating Iraqi troops were ordered by Hussein to destroy whatever they could on their way out. As they left Kuwait, the Iraqi troops set Kuwait's oil wells on fire. American forces could have conquered Iraq and removed Hussein from power, but many members of the coalition didn't want that to happen. The war ended with an American withdrawal, but the American government had encouraged oppressed groups in Iraq to revolt against Hussein and his regime. So they did, counting on American support. When the United States withdrew, Saddam Hussein slaughtered all those who spoke out against him. Besides the Gulf War, Bush is known for other achievements. In 1989, President Bush ordered the invasion of Panama, which is the small country that connects North and South America. The goal was to remove Panama's military dictator, Manuel Noriega. The invasion was extremely unpopular around the world, and tens of thousands of people were displaced from their homes due to destruction in the capital. President Bush bargained successfully for the reunification of Germany after decades of separation into West and East Germany. He also presided over the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, which officially marked the end of the Cold War. Domestically, Bush championed the creation of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which would make business transactions among Canada, the United States, and Mexico easier than they were before, but possibly at the expense of American jobs. NAFTA was eventually passed by the country's next president, Bill Clinton. In pop culture, Bush is most often remembered for the Gulf War, his broken promise not to raise taxes, and the moment in 1992 when he accidentally vomited on the Prime Minister of Japan.
Back in Washington yesterday, looking far more steady, the president chalked the incident up to a social nightmare.
When I get the flu, I do it in a very dramatic way, but it was so embarrassing.
It certainly was an embarrassing moment that Americans would not soon forget. Additionally, when Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton ran against President Bush in 1992, he wanted to make sure there were other things American voters did not forget.
Remember,
and if you elect me president, you will be better off 4 years from now than you are today.
average family income down $1,600 in 2 years.
You will be better off 4 years from now than you are today.
Family health care costs up $1,800 in 4 years.
You will be better off 4 years from
The second biggest tax increase in history.
If you elect me president, you will be better off 4 years from now than you are today.
Well, it's 4 years later. How you doing?
In the end, George H.W. Bush only served one term. Despite his high popularity ratings following the Gulf War, Bush lost the 1992 presidential election, mostly because his willingness to compromise allowed other politicians to paint him as untrustworthy. In the next lesson, we're going to look at President Clinton's first term.